Okay, willkommen, guten Abend. Welcome to our German Heritage Society Stammtisch tonight. In our recording tonight, we did have you come on board with a mute. We'd like to welcome all of you. It doesn't mean we don't want to know your questions because we're expecting a number of people. We'd like to give Dawn, our presenter, time to answer questions at the end. So if you have questions and wouldn't mind putting those in the chat, I'll be keeping an eye on that tonight. My name is Janet Price, and I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues, Bill and Ron.
All right. What I'm going to do is
first,
and then I'll turn it over to Ron. My name is William Selm. I'm on the board of directors of the Indiana German Heritage Society and the co-chairman of the programs. Our program is called Stammtisch, and we've been doing this since 1984, whereby we're looking to explore different aspects of Indiana German heritage and culture, many different aspects. So tonight's program, and it'll be introduced by Ron Flick. Our speaker is Don Flick, and of course, as you can see, it's Hoosier Germantowns and their fates, which is a very interesting topic about the landscape of the state. Next month, on March 10th, the Stammtisch program will be the poetry of Norbert Kropf, and Norbert Kropf was the past Indiana Poet Laureate from 2008 to 2010. He is a native of Jasper, Indiana, down in Du Bois God's Country County. And he just published this past year a new book called poetry called Southwest by Midwest. Our program in April, which will be April 14th, is called Germans of Haymarket, the Impact of German Radicals in the Struggle for the 8-Hour Workday and the Making of May Day. That'll be presented by Nicholas Selm. And then on May 12th, we have a passages from a memoir. It's called Appi's Berlin Diaries, My Quest to Understand My Grandfather's Nazi Past. and it's presented by Professor Emerita of IU South Bend, Gabriella Robinson, which should be proved to be very, very interesting. And then in June 9th, it's German Landmark Preservation in Du Bois County, presented by architect and Jasper native Ron Fleck, who is the twin brother of our presenter tonight, Don. We will take a break in July, and then we'll have other programs lined up and named coming into August, September, October, and November, and December. So stay tuned. These are going to be by Zoom until it's safe to come out. And so tune in next month for the program presented by Norbert Kropf. So I'm going to turn this over right now.
Bill, if I may interrupt
Yes.
quickly.
Yes,
a
of course.
reminder of the annual, I'm Giles Hoyt of the Research Committee, and I remind you of the annual meeting of the Indiana German Heritage Society is on March 19th, also via Zoom, so we'll all be virtual. The meeting is at 5 o'clock. There'll be information on it on our website, of course, www.ighs.org. And then a program at 7 o'clock, yes, 7 o'clock with Don Heinrich Tolzmann, Professor Dr. Don Heinrich Tolzmann from the University of Cincinnati, where we'll be talking about his publications, recent research, and German Americana as it is now and what it may look like as we go along. So just a reminder to keep an eye out for information coming about the Indiana German Heritage Society annual meeting, March 19th.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hoyt, and I'm glad you punctuated that with that important announcement. And one last thing is, if you are not a member of the Indiana German Heritage Society, please join. And you can do that easily through ighs.org. ighs.org. Please join up. We need you so that we can continue doing these programs, our publications, our scholarships, all the other things that we do to promote Indiana German heritage. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Ron Fleck, and Ron's going to explain what's in store for us. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to introduce someone I've known since prior to birth, my womb mate, Don Fleck, born and raised in Jasper, Indiana, heavily German Catholic community in Southern Indiana. He graduated from Jasper High School as valedictorian of his class in 1978. He earned his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Ball State University in 1983 and received his architectural registration in 1987. He worked for a number of firms beginning in Austin, Texas, and later in Indianapolis before starting his own firm in about 2001 or so, 2000. Sometime around then. He has been active member in the Irvington Historical Society, a past presenter. So now I introduce my older brother by about 10 minutes, Don Fleck.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I will proceed unless I get a chat that says I
Yeah.
can't hear me. Okay.
We
Sounds
hear
good.
you fine.
Okay. So I started thinking about this presentation a couple of years ago, and I was going to do it on one specific Germantown that I had in mind, not knowing that there were others in the state. But once I started doing some research into it, other Germantowns started popping up. And I thought, well, this is kind of a cool presentation. I'll just combine all these and figure out what happened to all these other Germantowns. And it was really predicated on an article that I found in the Richmond Weekly Palladium, August 15th, 1838. that was a reprint from an article in the Indiana Farm it was called Names of Places, and was originally published in the Indiana Farmer, reprinted in the Palladium in Richmond in 1838. And the story was about place names in Indiana. And there was a comment that said, after talking about how there was a bunch of places in Indiana that are named after other cities and other states in the United States, and we need to be more creative. It goes on to say, but what we most regret is the multiplicity of the same names in our own state. We find in Colton's new map of Indiana that the names of, and it lists 53 town names like Mount Pleasant and Liberty and Georgetown, occur twice. They listed 9 town names that occur 3 times, and Germantown 4 times. So the most prevalent name of a town in Indiana in 1838 was Germantown. It had showed up 4 times, and it was on this new Colton's new map of Indiana. So that really intrigued me, and I was going to use that then as the basis for this presentation. So I wanted to get a hold of that map, but the pandemic hit and I didn't get to track down the map at the Indiana Historical Society for a long time. So I knew what 3 of the Germantowns were, but I had to kind of figure out what the 4th one was. And as I eventually did find the map at the Indiana Historical Society, I pulled it out and I found 3 of the Germantowns, but not the 4th. So what were the 3 that were on the map were, and here's an image of the title of that map that it was down at the Indiana Historical Society. Well, there was definitely one in Marion and that bridged between Marion and Hamilton County. I knew that because that was what the original topic of my presentation was going to be. So the one between Marion and Hamilton counties. I found out that there was one in Wayne County originally called Germantown. There was one down in Floyd County that was called Germantown. And then after doing, and it not showing up on that map, even though it said it was 4 times, I did find out that with further research, where was the 4th? Was in, I thought they were talking about one in Vanderburgh County down near Evansville. So I went about then researching those 4 Germantowns, and do they still exist? And going back to that article where it said Germantown 4 towns, 4 towns that, the next sentence is, the above are names of towns and a number have post offices of the same name, thus leading to much confusion in the conveyance of letters. So the whole concept of the post office, postal delivery plays into this pretty importantly, because that's why these many of these were names changed. So let's do a little detour about post offices. And the postal department was one of the earliest things developed as in the United States. It was actually in the Constitution. Mail delivery originated with stagecoaches in the 1600s in Britain, and that carried over into the United States. Once flatboats were invented, they started delivering mail by flatboat around here in the Midwest. Steamships came about in the 1810s, and they were delivering mail by that. And then when railroads came about in the 1820s, that's when mail delivery really started getting big time. And the first railroad in Indiana was in 1838, which just happens to be that same year that that map was, that article that I began the presentation with. So the first railroad was between Madison and Indianapolis. The first railroad in Indiana was between Madison and Indianapolis in 1838. So it comes into play, the whole aspect of the railroad. So again, much confusion of conveyance of letters. So they found out that having multiplicity of names of towns caused havoc with delivery of mail. Because if you wrote Germantown, Indiana, which Germantown, Indiana did you mean? So the postal department came out with rules in the 1840s that said, for when you're applying for a new post office, It is preferable to have some local or permanent name, which must not be the name of any other office in the state. And you should aim to select a name not appropriated to any office in the United States. So they really wanted a unique name for your post office in your town, so that they didn't have any duplicity of names for towns. And again, no others in the state, none in the United States. And that's why on maps of this area, you get town names like Hamilton with Zinsburg Post Office and Osceola with Mercury Post Office. Towns started naming their post offices something else other than their town names. And then that just created a bit confusion in itself, and we'll get into that. So here was a sample postal directory from 1854. And these are all the towns, all the post offices, all throughout the whole United States. And Germantown shows up in Indiana, Kentucky, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Illinois. And there's obviously many others throughout. So anyway, let's do a detour and talk about the one in Pennsylvania, because the original Germantown was right outside Philadelphia. It was where the first German settlers landed in America, 1683. And that was named Germantown. And so there are other towns later were after that first one in Philadelphia. I want to show this little bit of slide. German immigration to the United States in the 1700s, after that 1683, there was about 1,000 on average Germans that came to America per year through the 1700s. So by the end of that century, there was about 100,000 Germans that had arrived. There was a trickle of German immigration up until the 1820s. There was only still about 5,700 Germans that came to the United States in the 1820s. But in the 1830s, it really started taking off. And then in the 1840s, it really, really started taking off until it peaked in the 1880s. So again, that map that I just began the presentation with, 1838, you can see that that's when Germans are really starting to show up in the United States. And again, going back to that directory and keying on the one in Indiana, they have one located in Indiana, and it was in Marion County, with the IA being the 2-digit abbreviation for Indiana at the time. So what happened to these other German towns that were on that map? Did they have post offices, or did they have different names? So that was my desire to research. Do they still exist? Let's go down to the one that appeared in Floyd County and go to a history of the Ohio Falls cities and their counties, 1882, where I looked up the Germantown. And in that history, it says that Germantown, when the question of making a turnpike out of the old New Albany and Vincennes Road began to be agitated in 1836, 2 years before that map, this little village came into life. It was laid out and platted by George Sease, S-E-A-S-E, May 27th, 1837. Mr. Sease owned the land upon which the village was platted and thought perhaps he could make a fortune by building a new town on this great thoroughfare and turnpike. So down near New Albany to Vincennes, there was a road, and George Sease wanted to lay Germantown out in Floyd County, 1837. He thought he'd make a lot of money by laying out a little town right there. And if you want to take a look at that Sease name, I went back a few generations, and it was spelled S-I-E-S-S a couple of generations before, and then S-U umlaut S-S. So he was a Pennsylvania German descendant. In 1718, his ancestor came from Alsace. By 1749, they had emigrated to Pennsylvania. His father was born in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 1763. He was born in 1793 in Virginia. By that time, his names had been anglicized to Sease, S-E-A-S-E. He was living in Maryland in 1814 when he got married. By 1837, he was in Floyd County, and in 1837, he plats Germantown. And then in the 1838, it shows up on that Colton's map in Floyd County. Then just 2 years later, with all this postal delivery issues arising because of the trains getting around and delivering mail, there was an act in the state legislature to change the name of the town of Germantown in Floyd County to that of Galena. So the town of Germantown in Floyd County only lasted 2 years, and then it changed its name to Galena. And then the town founder, George Cease, died in 1844. So here's a map from 1859 that shows Galena as the name of the town. Going back to that history, that was written in 1882. It does talk about what happened to Galena. It says the inhabitants of this town are considerably less than 100. There is a church, a school, 3 doctors, and a lodge of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. It is a rather drowsy little village, and like nearly all others of its kind, the daily batch of the neighborhood gossip, retailed gratis from corner dry goods boxes and much whittled chairs and stools, forms about the only entertainment of a portion of its people. So in 1882, it wasn't much of a town. It does still exist. This is you could see that kind of grid there. That's the town from an aerial perspective. If you zoom out a bit, you can start seeing some other development around there. And if you get out a little bit further, you can see that it's not too far from New Albany, Clarksville, Jeffersonville, and Louisville. It sits out in a little bit of rural area. It's Galena, and it was once called Germantown. There's some historic buildings there. That upper left is a cool mill that's now a hair salon. The old school down at the bottom right. There's an old Methodist church and a cool old cemetery with not a lot of German names in the cemetery. My brother and I went through that just last week, actually, taking pictures. So that's Galena, which was the Germantown of Floyd County. Now moving on, the fourth Germantown that I thought was going to be on that map that I still hadn't seen, never did locate, was in Vanderburgh County. And with that, I found evidence of that being in Germantown from a history of Vanderburgh County written in 1889 that talks about on the southeast, in talking about this community, on the southeast corner of Section 9, Township 6, South Range, blah, 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 as early as March 1838. That's why I thought he must have been on that map. J.W. Lilliston laid out a town and named it Germantown. And a little bit of fast facts for that. John West Littleton was born in Virginia. He served in the War of 1812. Appeared in the land records of Maysville, Kentucky in 1823. And by 1831, he was living in Evansville, and he had donated to the creation of a church. In 1833, he was appointed to a committee to request a railroad and a hospital to serve Indianapolis. In 1834, he served as a Vanderburgh County Justice of the Peace. 1837 to 1838, he was listed as a taxpayer in Pigeon Township of Vanderburgh County. And in 1837, his son purchased the land on which would become the Germantown Village. 1838, he laid out the town, began selling lots, and on that same year, he was appointed to a 7-year term as a circuit court judge. But after only 4 years, he resigned. And you wonder why he resigned after a 7-year term. It might have been because almost all of the lots in the town had delinquent taxes. His name was being dragged around in the mud in the newspapers owing back taxes, 1843 to 1845. So I imagine that's probably what led to him resigning as judge. The town never really took off. It does still show up on an 1861 map, but in 1876, in German Township, which was created in 1845, 7 years after the town was created. In the site of where Germantown was, it's called Casson Post Office at the site of the former Germantown. And Casson was they named the post office after it because it was the assistant U.S. postmaster's name. They were trying to get in good with the postal service, so they decided to name the post office after the assistant postmaster. So here is 1861, the post office being established where the site of Germantown was under the name of Casson. Casson shows up in later maps. This is an 1880 map. This is an area that has heavily German. And if you look at some of these names, Leffler, Ziegler, Seibert, Hetzel, Pfaffli, Schmidt, Schuttler, Deutsch, love that one, shows up on this 1880 map. So you can see it was heavily German. That's why it's called German Township, Germantown. So Germans moving into the Evansville area. Going back to that 1889 history, it does talk about Casson. This is more of that quote that I had quoted before. Contains a post office and blacksmith shop, but is without prospects of becoming important. Very near Casson, and this is where that original quote picked up. J.W. Wilson laid out a town and named it Germantown, but it never attained importance. So again, another little town, not really getting to the point where its original founder had wanted it to be. It did show up on later maps. Here it is in 1908. Here is that same area overlaid with today. Diamond Avenue is a 4-lane highway that goes right through the old part of the town, heads over to Posey County and New Harmony. Again, it sits out to the northwest of Evansville. And there are some cool old historic buildings still there. The original Casson School up on the upper left has been turned into a pretty grand home. I just saw this last week too on my drive down there. There was a old mill and the old mill restaurant down on the lower left still there. And here's the old mill, and that's still in business. But that's the town of Casson, not much to it, but it was the Germantown in Vanderburgh County. Now, going to the Germantown that was in Wayne County. This one is an interesting town. So where I got most of my information on its beginnings, 1872 Wayne County history. It started out as the town of Germantown. The town was laid out by George Shortridge, proprietor. It was originally named Georgetown after himself, and the plat was recorded August 1st, 1827. The name was afterward changed to Germantown and recorded under that name in 1832. So in 1832, because there was another Georgetown, the town changed its name to Germantown, but then led to a lot of problems in itself. So the name of its post office is East Germantown to distinguish it from an earlier one named Germantown in this state. And the town also seems to have taken the name of East Germantown. So this is 1872, and they seem to have taken the name of East Germantown. This town has a real identity problem. So George Shortridge is born in Kentucky in 1781. 1811, the Shortridges moved into Jackson Township. They're the first white settlers in that township. 1820s, lots of Pennsylvania German families start moving into the area. They're coming down the National Road. They hop over Richmond, and they start planting themselves in this area. Names like Waltz, Hunsinger, Leonard, Schock, Schaefer, Bauner, Guy, Sowers, Heist. And these are names of German families that had been Americanized because they were Pennsylvania Germans 2 or 3 generations removed from the immigration. 1822 in that area, Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church is established as the first Lutheran congregation in Indiana. Then 1827, George Shortridge lays out Georgetown, and then 1832, it's changed to Germantown. 1838, back to that 1838, Germantown appears on Colton's Indiana map. 1840, another Pennsylvania German religious denomination establishes its first congregation in Germantown. So this was a real hotbed for Pennsylvania German descendants. It's probably the earliest really Germantown in Indiana. It's a real prize in German heritage. In 1846, to differentiate itself from these other Germantowns, it established a post office under the name of East Germantown, but the town retained the name of Germantown. So the post office has the name East Germantown, the town is Germantown. And then in 1853, the railroad station is established under the name of Germantown. So the town and the railroad are Germantown, the post office is East Germantown. And here's a picture of that evangelical church, Lutheran church. There's a lot of cool old tombstones with German script or German lettering, German words, or references to the counties in Pennsylvania where their families were born. That was the Lutheran. This is the other German cemetery that's in the town. It's a smaller one. This was done by a brethren-related denomination. There's a few old buildings in the town. But then by 1880s, the corporate name of the town is changed to East Germantown to match that of the post office, but the name of the train station remained Germantown. So the post office and the town are now East Germantown. The train station remains Germantown. Then World War I hits, and we get launched into World War I with all its anti-German sentiment. And dachshunds became problematic, and names of teaching German became problematic. And then there was a bill introduced that would knock out German names. So cities, towns, or hamlets bearing the name Berlin or Germany, or cities or towns having streets so named, would be required to change them to Liberty, Victory, or some other American name. So that was a bill that was introduced in the United States Congress. I don't believe it got passed, but there was a real sentiment to start changing names that had anything to do with German. So in 1917, town residents signed a petition to change the name to Verdun, which was a town in France, instrumental in the war, but the local postmaster suggested Pershing in honor of General John Pershing to avoid similarity to Vernon in Indiana. So they decided to name it after John J. Pershing, the leader of the expeditionary forces of World War I. Well, the town residents sent a petition, or it was submitted to the U.S. postmaster. The postmaster agreed to change the name of the local post office to Pershing, but the Pennsylvania Railroad denied the request to change the name of the railroad station to Pershing until the Indiana State Legislature approved the name change. Thus, the town's corporate name remained East Germantown. The railroad was still called Germantown, but the post office was Pershing. So now that town had three names. By 1920, this was still being kicked around, even though the war had ended. With the Indiana State Legislature still not having acted upon the name change, a petition was presented to the town board, signed by 2/3 of the town residents, to officially change the corporate name of the town to Pershing from East Germantown. But the day before the town board meeting, a rumor was started by the East Germantown faction that changing the name of the town to Pershing would invalidate property ownership in the town, which was, of course, disinformation. That wasn't true, but the East Germantown faction won out, and the towns kept the name of East Germantown, with the post office retaining the name Pershing. So at this point, the town had been Georgetown, Germantown, and then East Germantown, and was still East Germantown officially. The railroad station was named, and still always was, Germantown, and the post office had been East Germantown and became Pershing. So they had a real identity crisis. And now we take a little detour up to Fulton County with a little town called Germany. And why do I bring this up? It's because, and there's Germany right there, just northwest of Rochester. They got in on the act too. They didn't want to be known as Germany. So in 1917, the inhabitants of Little Germany in Fulton County decided to name their town. What did they name it? Pershing, which or should I say 9. It ends that detour and we go back to Germantown and Wayne County. So we had the identity crisis of the town in Wayne County, we have another town in Fulton County called Pershing, and that led to even more problems. So this is a 1947 article that talks about the amusing and confusing names of the Wayne County town having 3 names. And it says, if anyone sends freight to Pershing, Indiana, it ends up in Fulton County, because that was what the railroad considered the actual Pershing, Indiana. But if anyone sent a letter to a person living near Pershing in Fulton County, it went to Wayne County Pershing Post Office, because Pershing in Fulton County did not have a post office. To add to the confusion, if a person sent freight to East Germantown, the railroad didn't consider the railroad station called East Germantown. So they didn't consider East Germantown a shipping point. The railroad still considered it Germantown. So freight and mail was getting thrown around everywhere between Fulton County and Wayne County and who knows where. And it just kept leading to problems. But the town, if you go by there now, it's landed on pretty much East Germantown, but the post office still says Pershing. And just coincidentally, even though they tried to be American and shed their German past, if you take that Pershing name and go back a few generations, it actually was Furshing. The general's great-great-grandfather was Friedrich Pershing, who immigrated to Pennsylvania from Alsace in 1749. So even though they wanted to shed their German past, they were still kind of doing a nod to their Pennsylvania German heritage by naming the town Pershing, even though I don't think they really knew that, but it was just kind of a jokes on them. It's still a German name. So this is a town with Georgetown, Pershing, Germantown, East Germantown. And I like this article that said Pershing is the most interesting town, 1928, and it still remains that way. So by 1854, we go back to that directory. We see that where there was one Germantown, the East Germantown and Wayne Township, or Wayne County, and Galena and Floyd County do show up in that postal directory. So let's go, and then here's the Germantown in that Marion. So we're now down to one in the one Germantown in Indiana in the postal directory. So now let's go to what my original intent on this presentation was, the Germantown that straddled the border between Marion and Hamilton County, and what happened to that. So here it is up in the upper right-hand corner of a map from way back. I don't have the date on that. There was if you look up the legends of how this town was founded, about the mid-1900s, for some reason, they started talking about that it was founded because an Indian had been killed near Oak Landon, and a bunch of German settlers, homesteaders, didn't like that, and they moved out of Oak Landon, which is to the south of it. And formed the town of German death. And I did find this entry on, and then let me know if I've got okay. So in 1944, 1927, they did publish a couple articles that talked about Germantown being founded by 2 people called John Solomon and George Beaver. And when I started reading into John Solomon and George Beaver, I found information on George Beaver, but I couldn't find anything on John Solomon. The name didn't exist in Marion County in 1834. So I thought, oh, what's wrong with that? So the more I looked into it, I found out that's misinformation. So that it was not John Solomon and George Beaver, it was John Solomon and George Beaver. They were 3 brothers. And if you look at the Beaver name, it had been Bieber a couple generations before. Again, these people were Pennsylvania German descendants that had migrated into Marion, or actually Hamilton County. So Johann Heinrich Bieber and his wife were married in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 1772. The Biebers lived in Pennsylvania, moved to Rowan County, whereas in Butler County, Rowan County, North Carolina, and then eventually into Butler County, Ohio, where the three brothers were born. In 1830, the family moved to Hamilton County, Indiana, near Fishers. And then in 1834, the three brothers founded Germantown in the upper right-hand corner of Marion County and straddling into Hamilton County. There's some really cool pictures of what Germantown in that area looked like. Here's a couple bridges from the town. One was a covered bridge, one was a steel truss bridge. Here's an old mill that was in the town, near the town. Here's some pictures. These are all available online, of some German descended families that lived in the area. So here it is in well, I jumped ahead here. But anyway, by 1938, the Indianapolis Water Company started buying up all the property in that area. You can see Germantown there, and this is a 1938 map where it says Indianapolis Water Company. And that was the president of the Indianapolis Water Company was Clarence Geist, who happened to die that year, 1938, where that map was. And he was the inspiration behind the planting a reservoir, damming up Fall Creek for drinking water for the growing population of Indianapolis. So they decided to name the reservoir after Clarence Geist. So here's Geist Reservoir construction pictures. You can see they start tearing down the bridges. That's the dismantling of that wooden bridge. And then here's a 1937 picture before they dammed it up, but that's the site of Germantown. And I have a series of overlays here. So here it is now, that's Geist Reservoir, and that's the site of where Germantown was. And if we zoom in a bit, you can see the town showing up in that little bend in the road. And there it is there. And then we get a little bit closer, and there it is. And then as I zoomed in, I looked to the right and I go, I wonder what that thing is right there and what was there. And it was there in 1956. It looks like a tree or something growing up through the reservoir. And it was part of this farm right here, just to the east of Germantown. So here's some more pictures, a 1960 picture of Geist Reservoir where Germantown, and with Germantown up in the upper right there, the location where that was. Now, Geist Reservoir is a really swanky area. It's got a lot of wealthy people living there. It's very developed. But the pioneer people still are buried in the area. There's 3 actually cemeteries with beavers there. This is Henry Beavers, one of the brothers, actually a 4th brother. He's buried in Bill's Cemetery, which is just to the south of where Germantown was. Arnett Cemetery at the upper right hand, that's where George Beaver, one of the proprietors, is buried. And then there's actually a Highland, which is also known as the Beaver Cemetery in Fishers, where another Beaver family member is buried. And the Beaver family continues to be a big family in the Fishers area. There's a lot of descendants. They own stone processing, gravel yards and stuff like that. But they're still a big family right there. And the curious thing about this is, I always thought this was coincidental that the name Geist, which in German means, has gotten into our English language through words like poltergeist and zeitgeist, actually means ghost or spirit. So you can kind of think that the ghost or spirit, the spirit of Germantown, lies in the underwater of Geist Reservoir, which is Spirit Reservoir. So I thought that was pretty coincidental. Those were founded in 1838. And was there more? And as I started, I thought I had found them all. And then, yes, there were more. Yeah. There was one in Boone County, actually. And I found that in an 1852 article. One day I ran across that said the Cars Railroad
are now running daily on the Indianapolis and Lafayette Railroad from Lafayette to Germantown in Boone County, only 17 miles from Indianapolis. Hacks run daily from our city to this point. And I thought, Boone County? So there's one in Boone County? And I started looking into histories of Boone County, and I got my Google map out and did a 17-mile radius up to Boone County from downtown Indianapolis. And I landed in a spot between Zionsville and Whitestown. And I thought, well, and I looked at a 1876 map and I didn't see anything labeled Germantown. So I dug around a little bit, thinking, okay, 17 miles from Indianapolis. Lafayette and Indianapolis Railroad was being built. The direction that the railroad was being built was southeast from Lafayette to Indianapolis. Zionsville was established in 1852 and named after William Zion, who was actually the commissioner of the Lafayette and Indianapolis Railroad. Then I looked at Whitestown, 1851, established train station. And I thought, let's look into Whitestown a little bit. Whitestown was named after Albert White, which was the board president of the Lafayette and Indianapolis Railroad. And there he is showing up on that certificate. And I thought, well, Whitestown, was that maybe named something before it was named after White? Because the railroad got there in 1851. Was there anything there before 1851? So I pulled out an 1853 map and I looked a little hard at that area and I saw New Germantown, right where Whitestown was. So let's look. I went online and found a wonderful website called whitestownhistory.com. And they had all kinds of little histories of Whitestown. And I found the notation that Whitestown was founded by Ambrose Nice in 1849 as Germantown. So well after that 1838 map, but 11 years later, there was another Germantown that had been created by Ambrose Nice. So let's look at that Ambrose Nice name. Nice, a generation before that spelling was N-E-A-S-E. Before that, they had not had an E on the end. And before that, it was N-E-H-S, again, descendant of Pennsylvania Germans. So let's do some fast facts on the Nace family. Johann Michael Nace was born in Germany, 1730. His family immigrated to Pennsylvania in 1731. 1757, they're in Virginia. 1815, they moved to Tennessee. 1816, Ambrose Nice is born in Tennessee. 1830s, lots of Pennsylvania German families living in the Tennessee area decide to move up to Worth Township in Boone County. Names like Nice, Loeffner, Ottinger, Eisenhower. 1840, they established a German Lutheran church in that Worth Township on land donated by Ambrose Nice. Ambrose Nice plats Germantown, 1849. 2 years later, the Lafayette and Indianapolis Railroad reaches Germantown. The train station is established under the name of New Germantown to distinguish it from the other Germantowns. In 1854, New Germantown receives approval for a post office contingent on the name of the post office not being New Germantown. So they decide at that point to name the town Whitestown, or at least the post office. The town continued under the name of New Germantown. The post office is under the name Whitestown. In 1854, which is the little map down here, it still lists the name as New Germantown. Oh no, actually that's a little bit later. In 1855, the first mention of Whitestown appears in an Indianapolis newspaper. 1864, the name New Germantown is still showing up on maps, but it's also sharing spot with Whitestown, 1864. That's the 1864 Colton's map. And then in 1897, Ambrose Nice dies. So again, we have a town with a little bit of an identity problem here, but so there was a lot of Pennsylvania German families that I had mentioned.
moved in. A lot of them are buried in Union Lutheran Cemetery in that area. These are nieces. There's Ottingers are really big up there. I have a niece and nephew named Ottinger that's from this family. So here's some of the tombstone names of the Pennsylvania German families that had migrated there: Nice, Lofner, Eder, Ottinger, Eisenhower, Bowers. A lot of these names are on the old part of town, show up on their street names: Utz, Bowers, Nice, Lofner. The town really was created because, or really developed because of that railroad connection. This was a map of the town in 1878 under the name of Whitestown. It had some historic churches to the right. That was the old school. On the left, that's been torn down. The church on the bottom right, I believe, is torn down. The upper right is the Lutheran church that had been established by Nice. Here's some pictures of old, and I got to credit that Whitestown, online Whitestown history. I got these all from them. The one left looks like a German saloon. It's got a P. Lieber Lager beer sign. They look very German. Here's some downtown buildings. A mill, another downtown, again, what the town used to look like. The town changed very little. This is 1945. It pretty much still just was the footprint of what it was in the 1870s, 1880s. Here's the old town today, but it's gone through a real growth spurt. So here's going into the old town. It kind of looks like a little sleepy downtown like anywhere else in Indiana, a small town. Here's a picture below of the two churches that are still along the main street. But the town was incorporated in 1947. It remained largely rural through the 1990s, but it's been going through exponential growth the last 20 years because of growth outside of Indianapolis into Zionsville. It's become the fastest growing community in Indiana for the past 8 years. If you see the population over there, 2000, it was still at 471. 2010, 2,867 it had jumped to. Estimated 2019, 9,092. So here's the little town aerial today. If you go out, you could see just to the south of it, the homes that are being built just south of it. And then there's a major development even south of this called Anson that's got a lot of multi-family, multi-use residential, commercial. It's really growing. It's just, it's probably going to be 50,000 people in no time. But it's a booming little town right now. So that was once Germantown in Boone County. So that was 5. Were there more than 5? Well, actually, yeah. There was a neighborhood in Indianapolis called Germantown, and many people that are part of the German Heritage Society know this. And I found 2 evidences of the town being, or the neighborhood called Germantown in 1840s newspapers, 1850s. This was in a newspaper called The Locomotive, and it said on an article called The Northeast End of Indianapolis. It's going on. This has been particularly the case in the Bates and Fletcher's edition. This edition occupies 4 blocks, bounded on the north by New York Street, on the east by Noble, which is now College Avenue, on the south by Market, and on the west by East Streets. And this edition is more generally known as Germantown from the fact that a great many Germans have bought and built here. So here in a 1867 map are those 4 blocks that they mentioned. And by 1867, you can see all the German churches and the German newspaper, Volksblatt, and the future side of the German Das Deutsche Haus Athenaeum that had all grown up around this German community known as Germantown. But what happened to it? Oh, here's another, one more reference to this. I found one more reference, 1852, in a article about Independence Day in a fireman's parade. It said that there's the Invincible is a company recently organized in that part of the city known as Germantown. So again, going back to those 4 blocks, what happened to those 4 blocks? Well, they were no longer residential after a while. If you do a aerial map of it now, it's gotten to be very industrial. And the only evidence of residential in this whole area is that little spot right there in the upper northeast corner with this little house at 234 North College, I believe is the only evidence from that era of any kind of residential. But not to fear. That's the area today. But if you just go to the north of that, in an area around Lockerbie Street, that's a very residential area that our president of our August group knows very well. And it has some wonderfully renovated old homes from the 1800s. This is on Lockerbie Street itself. And that was a home that famous Indiana poet James Whitcomb Riley had lived in. And he had written and Lockerbie Street got to be popular with a poem he wrote in 1883 and was published in Life magazine called Lockerbie Street, where all the stanzas ended with Lockerbie Street, with a resting place fairer than Lockerbie Street, and with the gold of the sunshine of Lockerbie Street. And so it was a really popular poem by James Whitcomb Riley, and it really brought some notoriety to Lockerbie. Now, a lot of people thought he lived on that street when he wrote that, but he did not. He actually was not living on that street at the time when he wrote the poem, but he did later move into this house on Lockerbie Street and wrote this Lockerbie book of Riley verse. So because he was so well loved, and this is pictures from his funeral, the area that once was known as Germantown has become known as Lockerbie Square. So nobody knows it as Germantown anymore. It's now known as Lockerbie Square. So were there more than 6 Germantowns in the 1800s in Indiana? And before we answer that, is there a point to all of this? So if this were an educational endeavor, you would want to have a thesis. So yes, there is. So what were the commonalities? This is my educational part here. What are the commonalities and why the name Germantown was applied to early Indiana communities? Almost all of them were named before the major waves of German migration began in the 1840s. Most were applied to communities with connections to later generations of migratory 18th century German Pennsylvania families. Most of them were settled by later generations of Pennsylvania German families, but the names were chosen by town founders who were several generations removed from their Pennsylvania German ancestry, such as Cease in Floyd County, Neese in Boone County, and Beaver and Marion in Hamilton County. Others were chosen by town founders with no known German ancestry, but who saw opportunities in creating towns for the migratory descendants of Pennsylvania Germans. That was like Lewiston in Vanderburgh County and Shortridge in Wayne County. Germantown was a generic name with very little connection to the fatherland, as opposed to town names chosen by immigrants after the major migrations of Germans started in the 1840s, which were primarily either place names from their country of origin, like Bremen, Darmstadt, Elberfeld, Fulda, Hauptstadt from Germany, or Bern, Geneva, Viva from the Swiss. Or town communities like Celestine, Indiana. Why were the name Germantown changed? And its primary reason was due to concerns about delivery of mail. Galena and Floyd County, Casson and Vanderburgh County, Whitestown and Boone County, East Germantown and Pershing and Wayne County, or the desire to disassociate from their German heritage. So those were the motivating factors to change the name of the Germantown from Germantown to something else. So your question to me is, so none of the Germantowns are still known as just Germantown, correct? We had Germantown in Floyd County is Galena, Germantown in Vanderburgh County, Casson, Wayne County, East Germantown and Pershing. The Germantown in Marion, Hamilton County is now underwater in Geist Reservoir. And the one in Boone County is now Whitestown. So no just Germantown. Oh, and then the one in Indianapolis is Lockerbie Square. So none is named Germantown. 9. There was a 7th one. And where was it? It was not on that map. I thought it was when they talked about the one that was on the map in 1838. I thought it was the one in Vanderburgh County. There was another map. This map that I originally had seen was reduced from a larger map that was available at IU Library. And I found this map online at IU Library. And then I found a Germantown in Decatur County. And that actually still shows up in Google Maps if you look at it. It's just south of St. Paul. Some fast facts: descendants of Pennsylvania Germans by the names of Ansbach, Knaus, Kur, Leffler, Rieger, Shaner, Schubert, established there in the 1830s. Cemetery was established. Members of the Church of the United Brethren in Christ began meeting in a local schoolhouse, 1833. 1838, the Germantown appeared on that map. Union chapels erected adjacent to the cemetery. Indianapolis and the Cincinnati Railroad opened just north of Germantown in the neighboring community of St. Paul. So here's an 1853 map of Germantown. Here's where it is in Decatur County. If you look on the upper left-hand corner, you can see St. Paul, and Germantown's just underneath it. Here it is with today's on Google Maps. If you get a little bit closer and zoom out, to the south is rights to the north to the right. Down the county road is the church, German church and cemetery. Zoom in a little bit. It's a beautiful little church with a beautiful cemetery. Lots of Pennsylvania German names. It's not much of a town. It never had a railroad. It never had a post office. And that's probably a reason why it still continues to be called Germantown. And the only evidence of its name is a little sign on one of the light poles right there. So that is the only town in Indiana still named Germantown, known since 1800. So it's the only one of the 7 Indiana communities once known as Germantown to retain its original name. So let's give it a big hand. So Germantown in Decatur County is the only one. So that concludes my presentation. I'll take any questions.
Don, we have a comment from several comments for a great program. One is a question from the German teacher at Fisher's, Nicole Matthews. And she just wants to know if there's any way she can get access to this recording. And we just got our own Zoom account. I'm going to tell everybody that. So we are recording this with the intent of being able to share this recording on our website and perhaps through Facebook. I'll throw that out there. I need to be sure that's for sure, but we will certainly let you know. We'll get that word out there. So stay tuned. IGHS.org is where our website is, and we are looking to introduce that. Anybody else have any questions that I might throw out to Don? Have to say, I was just waiting for you, Don, it's because I have this little opening, to tell me where Germantown was in Vanderburgh County, because I thought, I wonder if it was in German Township, and
It indeed was. It's an area called Casson that doesn't really show up too much on maps, but it is the northwest side of Vanderburgh County.
Very, very familiar with Old Mill Restaurant back in the day, and that whole side of town, because everybody was German.
Resurrection Church, Catholic Church is right in the middle of it.
And that is the original town of Germantown, that Resurrection Catholic Church and that Old Mill Restaurant. Yeah.
Whole area out there. Yep. Super presentation. Lots of good comments. Well, that was wonderful. I learned, as a former German teacher, I learned a lot of things today too.
Well, I certainly enjoyed, I love getting around Indiana, and I visited them all. I've visited all of them, so, and it's pretty cool.
Somebody else wanted to tell you that Brian tells us he's, right now he's a member in San Antonio though, and learned a little bit about Galena, Indiana, near where he's from. He did not know it was formerly called Germantown.
There you go.
Don, this is Bill Selm calling.
Yes, yes.
A fantastic job. This is so good. You did your good documentation, especially with the maps. I like that. Now, that area, Germantown, is identified in the locomotive. It has been renamed by somebody or something as Coal Noble neighborhood.
Oh, yes, yeah.
which is-
After the automakers.
Right, and also Noble Street is now College.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
the sad part is they didn't dig deep enough. And again, I don't know. I don't know what the problem is, but if they really looked at it as you did, it's Germantown. And it's sad.
I was really amazed at how many German churches were around that area.
and
Just
also
really clustered.
and also the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation, which was largely German speaking. That was
That's
also
true. Yeah.
in the neighborhood. So
Yeah.
yes, it's pretty amazing. And then of course, Das Deutsche House is built later, much later, and then also St. Mary's German Catholic Church was built much later.
And, we got to really be thankful for the preservation of the Lockerbie community. In the 1960s, they were going to tear all those houses down and build an amusement park. And that was their idea of urban renovation, urban renewal. Thankfully, that didn't go through. So it's a wonderful little community.
Yeah, the area along New York Street was going to be a parking lot that with a row of commercial mixed buildings that would run along it that face the James Whitcomb Riley House. And the Riley House was the only one that was going to survive, really.
So you wouldn't have had your house there, Jim.
Yeah, no. Our lot would have been a parking lot.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Excellent job. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's really super. That adds to our knowledge of place names, German place names, and it's really, really good work. Thanks, Ron. You should work for a publication in Traces or the Society for German American Studies. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. Okay. Well, we'll see everybody.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Unless there's more.
Good evening. Yep.
We'll see everybody next month.
We'll,
for the
we'll,
next
we'll make
Stammtisch.
it available online. Okay.
Okay.
See you.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Terrific.
Bye-bye.
Don't forget the annual meeting and presentation. Thank you.
Yes. Good night, everybody.
Night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.